Since it is now 1 minute after 12, I can say good afternoon. And welcome to the Ann F. Baum Memorial Lecture on Elder Law. One of the things that I really liked about this university when I looked at it last year before I came here to become dean was that we have an outstanding elder law program, thanks in no small part to my colleague Dick Kaplan. So let's give Dick a hand for all the work he does. This is a terrific lecture series, and today is an especially big day because we have such an extraordinary person to deliver this year's installment. The series itself was endowed by a gift through the estate of Ann Baum. It seeks to promote analysis and discussion of questions located at the intersection of public policy, law, and aging. And these lectures serve as a fitting tribute to a woman, one of whose abiding passions was the rights and welfare of the elderly in our society. So it is with Ann Baum's memory and legacy firmly in mind that I introduce today's speaker. Few people are as qualified as Hank Greely to discuss the ethical, legal, and social implications arising from emerging genetic technologies, the topic of today's lecture. The Deanne F. and Kate Edelman Professor of Law, as well as a Professor of Genetics at Stanford, he directs the Stanford Center for Law and the Biosciences and the Stanford Program on Neuroscience in Society. Professor Greely also serves on a number of leading organizations focused on bioethics. He chairs California's Advisory Committee on Human Stem Cell Research, and he serves as a member of, among many other entities, the NAS Committee on Science, Technology, and Law, and NIH's Multi-Center Working Group on the Brain Initiative. He is, without question, one of the leading and most cutting-edge thinkers looking at the way new biomedical technologies and the law come together. Professor Greely earned his bachelor's degree at Stanford and his law degree from Yale. Before entering the academy, he clerked for Judge John Minor Wisdom of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. And for those of you who are a little too young, Judge Wisdom was a gigantic figure in the civil rights movement and in the South. And then Professor Greely clerked for Justice Potter Stewart on the U.S. Supreme Court. He also worked at the U.S. Departments of Defense and Energy, and he practiced law at the Los Angeles firm of Tuttle & Taylor before he started his academic career at Stanford. One of the few professors who was actually a partner in a great law firm before he became a professor. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Henry Greely.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you for that kind introduction. It's good to see that a California boy can thrive here in the Midwest. I was a little worried when I heard that you were moving to the wilds of the Midwest, but at least one winter seems to have agreed with you.
I brought the El Nino with me to warm here.
Okay. I also want to echo what Dean Amar said about elder law and the University of Illinois. The legal academy, every place has its own quirks. And in the legal academy, status, money, excitement tend to go to things that are either sexy or have a lot of money there to begin with. So corporate law, securities law, constitutional law, to some extent now intellectual property law. And those are important. And some of the people doing work in those areas are doing useful stuff. But you know, for most of the 320 million Americans, what most law professors do doesn't actually affect them very much, or if it does, it affects them only very indirectly or from time to time. But things like elder law or landlord-tenant law or consumer protection law, consumer bankruptcy laws, these are the things that affect most of the citizens and residents of this country, and the things that law schools don't spend very much time and effort on. And I'm guilty as well. I do the sexy law and bioscience stuff. I don't do the hard work of how that actually translates into care for individual patients and into the legal issues around care for individual patients very much, in part because it's not what is rewarded by the academy, but also in part because it's hard. One of the great things about doing things with federal law is there's only one law you got to look up. You do with elder law, there are 50 states, District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, Guam. Doing state-by-state work is hard, and law professors are on average, not stupid, and we go for things that are easier, like federal law, or like me, dealing with new technologies where there's basically no law that you have to look up at all. So I'm really pleased that the University of Illinois for a long time has supported elder law, both with the Elder Law Journal, now with an Elder Law Clinic, and with, I won't say Mr. Elder Law, but with Dick Kaplan, who's been working and teaching in this area for several years. Well, what I really want to talk about, though, is neuroprediction, using neuroscience to predict individuals' futures, which sounds like magic, and to some extent it can be, but like all new technologies, it has possible benefits and possible costs. When I was a kid, I read a lot of science fiction. And the dean of science fiction in my era was a guy named Robert Heinlein, who was widely considered the greatest science fiction author of his era, of the 50s and early 60s, 40s, 50s, and early 60s. His very first published story was called Lifeline. It was about a doctor named Hugo Pinheiro, who invented a device that would allow him to say down to the minute how long someone was going to live. So he could tell you not only the year of your death, but the day of your death and the hour of your death. Very few people have that knowledge today, unless you're condemned to death in a jurisdiction that doesn't believe in stays of execution and where unexpected things never happen. You don't really know when you're going to die. If I could tell you the day, time, year of your death, how many of you would want to know that? Raise your hands. I'm a law professor. We ask questions. Raise them higher. How many of you definitely wouldn't want to know that? How many are uncertain? Okay, so the nays definitely dominate the yays there. Now, we can't do that now. And I don't think we're likely to be able to tell you the date of your death. But modern medicine increasingly is able to predict other things about your future. And those things can be as disconcerting, or in some cases, I think, more disconcerting than questions of life and death. And I'm going to talk about those kinds of predictions coming out of neuroscience and dealing with the brain. But that's one example of a broader field. And when I talk about neuroscience, I'm going to specifically talk about one example of neuroprediction, predicting Alzheimer's disease. I want to talk about 5 things today. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on neuroprediction generally, a little bit of background on Alzheimer's disease generally, a little bit of information on predicting Alzheimer's disease and how we go about predicting it, and then some discussion of the pluses and minuses that come from being able to predict who is going to get Alzheimer's disease and when, before some concluding thoughts on what, if anything, we should do about it. So let's start with neuroprediction. And by neuro here, every field fractionates, cuts itself into smaller and smaller pieces and competing pieces. And I'm taking neuro very broadly as brain-related. So not necessarily pure neuroscience, but psychiatry, psychology, all stuff about brain. So in a sense, this is brain prediction. We are getting enormously better at being able to predict the future of your brain thanks to revolutions in neuroscience. The revolutions are, as all scientific revolutions always are, largely revolutions in tools, either physical tools. Astronomy wasn't very interesting before the telescope. Microbiology didn't do very much before the microscope. In this case, it's things like magnetic resonance imaging and functional magnetic resonance imaging. Sometimes they're conceptual tools. Machine learning algorithms, new statistical methods for making sense out of huge amounts of data are a tool that's advancing this. And sometimes they're tools from other fields. The Human Genome Project and the ability to do cheap sequencing is an enormous tool in neuroscience. So as a result of these new tools, today we know approximately infinitely more than we did about how the brain works 30 years ago. And 30 years from now, people will look back and say they knew nothing. And most of what they thought they knew was wrong. We are on the vertical part of the learning curve. A lot of that learning is not aimed at finding out how to predict things, but has that as a secondary consequence. most of the knowledge we have about neuroscience and diseases, about science and diseases, comes from efforts to treat them, cure them, prevent them. But one of the things you often want to know in order to try to do that is to figure out how they are caused. What is the natural history of the disease? What are the things that lead to it? And if you start looking at that, you begin to see, aha, this genetic variation is strongly associated with that. You learn that because you want to see what's causing it, where can you intervene, what are the targets for intervention. But once you know that that genetic association, that genetic variation is associated with the disease, you've got a predictor. Once you learn that amyloid plaque buildup is important in Alzheimer's disease, and then the tools let you see amyloid plaque buildup in living people, you have a predictor. So I think one of the interesting things about this field, prediction is growing enormously, but it's not really growing because people sit down and say, I want to come up with something to predict Alzheimer's disease. It's growing because they say, I want to understand more about Alzheimer's disease. And a secondary effect, and often an unexpected effect of that, is they have invented a predictor. The same is true in genetics, the same is true in any area of biomedical science. So neuroprediction is expanding dramatically. I'm going to talk about Alzheimer's disease. I'm part of a group, our Stanford program in Neuroscience and Society, or SPINS, is doing a working paper this year on neuroprediction. We're looking at Alzheimer's disease, we're looking at schizophrenia, and we're looking at dyslexia, a neurological disorder, a mental illness, and a behavioral trait. Each one of them has different science behind it. Each one of them also has different ethical, legal, and social implications. They hit at different times, they hit different people at different times in different ways. And the underlying story here is, as our knowledge of the brain expands enormously, our ability to predict things will expand enormously, and then we've got to figure out what we're going to do with them. Whether it's predicting who's going to get Alzheimer's disease, or whether it's predicting which one out of 100 10-year-old boys is going to grow up to be a psychopath. So that's a little on neuroprediction. Alzheimer's disease, I'm not going to talk very much about because I think everybody knows something about it. How many of you have seen a close friend or a relative with Alzheimer's disease? And those of you who did not raise your hands, you will be raising your hands at some point in the not too distant future. It is a terrible disease. My closest experience with it was my mother-in-law, who, whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, had a long, long life with Alzheimer's disease. She lasted about 12 years after the initial diagnosis, moving like a ghost through her home. My father-in-law refused to let her be institutionalized, said, I vowed for better or for worse. Not sure that was the best thing for her, but it was important to him. And she was, for the last half of that time, she didn't know who he was, she didn't know who she was. She was a ghost in a very, to call a disease evil is probably not really fair. I think to be evil requires some sort of consciousness and choice that diseases don't have. But if there's an evil disease, I'd put Alzheimer's right up there with it because it leaves the body and it robs people, it robs the person, it steals the person out of the body. So Alzheimer's disease is a dementia. It is important to realize that it is not the only dementia. So when I talk about predicting Alzheimer's disease, that's only predicting one out of many different causes of dementia. It is thought that Alzheimer's is responsible for about half the cases of dementia, and dementia, literally from the Latin, is D without mentia, mind. It is becoming mindless. Probably the other common source of dementia is something called multi-infarct or vascular dementia, caused by lots and lots of little mini strokes. There is now evidence that maybe Alzheimer's and multi-infarct dementia aren't that different, that they are connected at some rate. But we still tend to think of Alzheimer's as half, microinfarct is roughly 40%, and a bunch of other things is about 10%. I'll be talking about predicting Alzheimer's disease. If your Alzheimer's prediction says you are fine, you are never going to get Alzheimer's disease, it doesn't mean that you won't necessarily get microinfarct dementia or Lewy body dementia or any of a variety of other dementias. So that's an important thing to remember. One of the problems, though, of vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease is we don't really have very good numbers for which is which because it's not very easy to tell which is which. And there's really not much point to learning which is which because they both have the same level of effective treatments, basically nothing. There's not much you can do. It's nothing you do differently for Alzheimer's than for multi-infarct dementia. And as a result, we don't spend the time and effort to try to make a definitive diagnosis during lifetime. And the definitive diagnosis traditionally is made on autopsy, and there's usually not much point to doing an autopsy. Alzheimer's disease is defined as a dementia in a person whose brain, typically on autopsy, shows two signs, something called amyloid plaque, which is a buildup of a protein called beta amyloid 42 on the outside of neurons that are dying or dead, and tau tangles. Tau is another protein, and this forms tangles inside the cell body. So if you are demented and you have amyloid plaque and tau tangles, you by definition have Alzheimer's disease. If you're demented and you have amyloid plaque but no tau tangles, you're demented, but you don't have Alzheimer's disease. And the same if you've got tau tangles and not amyloid plaque. How many people have Alzheimer's disease? It's a good question. We don't really know. You'll see estimates. With this disease, as with every disease, there are disease organizations. Every disease in America has at least one disease organization. Most have more than one disease organization, which often spend as much time fighting each other as they do the disease. Alzheimer's Association, though, seems to have avoided that for the most part, and they tend to have high estimates of how many people have the disease. Other people have lower estimates. Part of it is the difficulty of telling Alzheimer's dementia apart from vascular dementia. Part of it is the difficulty of knowing when to say somebody is demented. At what stage do we say you've passed from having mild cognitive impairment to having frank Alzheimer's disease? And these are hard questions. The answer is clearly tens of millions. Your chances of developing Alzheimer's disease by the time you're 70 are at least 75, let's say, are at least 10%, and probably substantially higher than that. There is a bit of good news. There's a bit of epidemiology saying those rates are going down with time. It's thought that better control of cardiovascular problems, better control of heart disease, mainly through less smoking, but also cholesterol and blood pressure treatment, may be reducing the longer-term incidence of Alzheimer's. But whatever the number is, it is high, and it's going to get higher because people like Dick and I are going to get older. At least we hope we're going to get older, given the current alternatives. Our generation, the baby boom generation, is moving inexorably toward retirement, toward being elderly, and some of us, as a result, are moving inexorably toward Alzheimer's disease. So how do we go about predicting Alzheimer's disease? The third issue. And here, a couple of preliminary things. There's an interesting question, and I haven't decided whether it's just purely an academic question or whether it's a real question, whether it's a question that's truly important. When are we predicting disease, and when are we diagnosing asymptomatic disease? 30 years ago, I worked on a paper about HIV and AIDS. And it seemed to me that, and at that point, AIDS was the disease, HIV was the virus you got that ultimately led to the disease. And it seemed to me you could look at it two ways. Being HIV positive could be a predictor that you would eventually get the disease called AIDS. Or being HIV positive could be the disease, which had a series of symptoms that ultimately led to the state of having AIDS. Similarly, if we see early enough and we can say, you are 99% certain to get Alzheimer's disease, are we predicting that you're going to get Alzheimer's disease, or are we diagnosing you with a pre-symptomatic or maybe early symptomatic or maybe most likely symptomatic if you look hard enough state of Alzheimer's disease? So whether it's prediction actually or early diagnosis is a tricky question, and we have seen rates of Alzheimer's diagnosis increase in part because people are diagnosing earlier in part because of greater awareness of it, and in part because of some of these predictors. So that's one issue, one preliminary issue. A second preliminary issue, I can predict anything. I can call spirits from the vasty deep, to which the response in Henry IV was, "Aye, but will they come when you call?" I can make lots of predictions. It's easy to make predictions. It's just hard to be right. The accuracy of the predictions is really important. And we have, and I think it is possible that law is worse at this than many fields, but nobody's really good at it. We tend to think of accuracy as a number. Something is 98% accurate. The accuracy is really a lot more complicated than that. And you can think about specificity. How many false positives you get. If you do 100 tests, how many of them will falsely say somebody is positive? 99% specific says only one will say falsely positive. You can think of sensitivity, which looks at false negatives. If you're 99% sensitive, only one will be a false negative. And those two things, specificity and sensitivity, by the way, it's like stalactites and stalagmites. You can remember them because specificity has the P and is with false positives. And sensitivity has the N and is with false negatives. I think stalactites are ceilings and stalagmites are ground. So those things are usually inversely related. You can increase your sensitivity and limit the number of false negatives you get, but the result tends to be you get more false positives. Or you can increase your specificity and limit the number of false positives you get, but the result is you get more false negatives. Because you kind of, if you think about it as sort of a bell curve, you're moving where you decide to say, yes, I'm predicting you. And if you move it in one direction, you get more false positives and fewer false negatives. And if you move it in the other, you get fewer false negatives and more false positives, or the other way around. So those are useful. What's really useful is something called positive and negative predictive value, which will tell you what is the chance that a positive test actually is positive. Now that may sound like specificity, but in fact, it depends on how many people you expect to get the disease. So if you've got a disease that comes out in 1 in a million people, and you've got a test that is 99% specific, you test 100 people, you get 1 false positive. You test 1 million people, you get 10,000 false positives and 1 true positive. So your positive predictive value is a lot of zeros, followed by a 1. On the other hand, if we were to do a test for male or female, we expect that roughly 50% will fall into other categories. We'll say we're doing a test for male, we expect roughly 50%. If our test has 99% specificity, and we test 100 people, we'll get 1 false positive, but we'll get 50 true positives. And so our positive predictive value will be 50 over 51. Pretty good number. If you remember nothing else from this, if you didn't know about specificity, sensitivity, and positive and negative predictive values, negative predictive value is just the other side, how good you are, how likely a negative is likely to be a real negative. If you remember nothing else from this, remember that, because it's really useful in thinking about accuracy, and we don't teach it in law school, at least not very often. So, tests. How do we predict who's going to get Alzheimer's disease? There are 5 current methods. Behavioral issues, behavioral tests, genetic tests, neuroimaging tests, biomarker tests, and the 5th one that I'll remember by the time I get to it. First, behavioral tests. We do little tests. We give people memory tests, and we try to see if their memory is already affected. Because the best predictor for people who are going to get Alzheimer's, one of the best predictors for people who are going to get Alzheimer's, are people who, at an appropriate age, are already showing signs of memory problems. They're already doing less well on remembering X random numbers than they should be. And if you follow them over time and they continue to get worse at it, that's a pretty strong predictor that it may lead to a diagnosis of what's called mild cognitive impairment. And mild cognitive impairment, about half of people with mild cognitive impairment go on to develop frank Alzheimer's disease. A distinct Alzheimer's disease. It's not named frank Alzheimer's disease. It was Alois Alzheimer that was named after, not Frank. So that's a predictor. We see some other behavioral predictors. People have talked about sense of smell possibly disappearing in people who are going to get Alzheimer's disease. The most interesting of these to me is a study from Cincinnati, the nuns study. There was a convent in Cincinnati that had all of its novitiates write an autobiography when they entered the convent at 18, 20, whatever. And they now had a lot of, when the study was done, a lot of these women were now in their 70s and 80s, had been long retired. Many of them had Alzheimer's or other dementias. Many of them didn't. They went back and looked at those autobiographies, and they could see stylistic differences at age 18 that predicted well who was going to get dementia and who wasn't. Interesting finding, hasn't been replicated. Put it in the category of fascinating, needs follow-up. But the answer is you want to write like Faulkner, you don't want to write like Hemingway. And for those of you of a generation who don't know what that means, the longer, more complicated, more florid writing, I kind of hate this story in a way because I don't like purple prose, but the more complex your writing, the more likely you were not to be demented at age 75. And the more telegraphic your writing or the more simple your writing, and that's not quite fair to Hemingway, the less likely you were to be demented. By the way, another possible explanation for that, maybe the people who wrote better young had started with a better cognitive level. And as their cognitive reserve went down, as Alzheimer's ate into their cognitive abilities, it maybe just took longer for them to get diagnosed. But those are some behavioral examples of how people have been predicting Alzheimer's disease. The genetics is really interesting. When I talk about genetics, I use Alzheimer's as an example because it is completely genetic, partially genetic, and not genetic at all, depending. It's not just in law that it depends is the right answer to every question. There are about 1 person in 1,000, so chances maybe only 12 or 15% that somebody in this room has this, who have a mutation in a gene called presenilin 1, PS1. If you have a PS1 mutation, as far as we can tell, your chance of getting Alzheimer's disease is 100%, unless you die first of something else. And with PS1, you don't even have as much time to die first from something else because it is early onset Alzheimer's. It hits people in their 40s and 50s. The chief judge of the Fourth Circuit about 6 years ago retired at age 47 because she had early onset Alzheimer's disease. PS1 mutation, highly what geneticists call penetrant. If you've got the mutation, highly likely to have the trait or the disease. As far as we know, 100% likely. And it passes in what we call an autosomal dominant way. So if a parent has one bad copy of the gene, they get sick. Their kids have a 50-50 chance of getting that copy of the gene and getting sick. We could predict Alzheimer's disease with close to 100% accuracy at birth. Even before birth, at the embryonic stage, through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for that. But that's 1 person in 1,000. What about the other 999 of us? Well, about, I'd say, 30 people in this room have an Alzheimer's risk gene variant. There's another gene called ApoE, apolipoprotein E. ApoE comes in 3 forms, ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. Somebody want to ask me a question right now? What happened to ApoE1? It's actually a nice question because it says something about science and particularly about genetics. ApoE1 was really nasty, which meant it was the first one discovered and identified because it was easy to see. It caused a terrible blood disease. But evolution doesn't really like deeply nasty things. They tend to die out. So it's very rare because it's so strong, but it was found first because it was so strong. So you see this ascertainment bias, the things that are strong and nasty you tend to see first. Those are often the rarer ones. 2, 3, and 4 make up almost all the ApoE variations or alleles out there. Each of us has 2 copies of this gene, one from our mom, one from our dad. So we could be 2-2, 2-3, 2-4, 3-3, 3-4, or 4-4. Most of us are, about half of us are 3-3. 3-3s, oddly enough, have the average risk for Alzheimer's. They're most of the population. They end up with the average risk. About 2 to 3% of us are 4-4. A 4-4's risk of getting Alzheimer's is either very high or very low, depending on how you look at it. If you live to be 75, your risk of getting Alzheimer's appears to be in the 80 to 90% range. But lots of those people don't live to be 75 because it also has coronary artery disease implications, and they tend to die younger. So 4-4 has a really high risk of coronary artery disease, as well as a really high risk of Alzheimer's. But often you won't get there. Another issue with these risk numbers, you got to ask at what age. If you are 2-2, and about 2% of us are 2-2, your risk of getting Alzheimer's disease appears to be 0. A whole bunch of other nasty things that can happen to you, including vascular dementia, but not Alzheimer's disease. Most people, it's average, but if you're 3-4 or 2-4, and that's about 20% of the population, so roughly a fifth of the people in this room, there are probably 4 or 5 of us in this room, no, 2 or 3 of us in this room who are 4-4s, unless in fact the Nun study is true, and that means people more likely to get into law school are more likely to write like Faulkner and more likely not to, or the other way around. I don't know how the LSAT correlates with late life Alzheimer's risk. 2 or 3 of us would be 4-4s, but about 30 of us are going to be 3-4s or 2-4s. And that looks like your risk is about tripled. But what does about tripled mean? Well, by 75, it means somewhere between 30% and 45%. Those numbers sound pretty bad, but it means you're more likely than not to get Alzheimer's disease. So it's a predictor, but it's not a very strong predictor. But it turns out that of everybody with Alzheimer's disease, half of them don't have any PS1 problem or any ApoE4 allele version. Their genetics of Alzheimer's disease appears to be 0. Why do they get Alzheimer's? Maybe it's genes we don't know about, and there have been some weak associations with some other genes that haven't been replicable or replicated for the most part. Maybe it's environment. Maybe it's what their mom ate when she was 2 months pregnant with them. Maybe it's just bad luck. We don't know. So genetics can predict for 1 in 1,000 people really, really strongly. Although note, that also means for 999 out of 1,000, it can also make a strong prediction. It can say, you're not going to get early onset Alzheimer's as a result of PS1. Both the positive and the negative predictive value are quite high there. For most of us, it can say, well, you're at somewhat higher than normal risk, you're at somewhat lower than normal risk. You better make sure you see a cardiologist early because your Alzheimer's risk is the least of your problems. But we don't really know. Neuroimaging. The neuroimaging predictors look at things like use PET scans and CT scans, not CT scans, PET scans and MRIs. And they're looking basically now, and this has only been possible in the last decade or so. I told you amyloid plaque and tau tangles are necessary parts of the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. We can now use PET scans, positron emission tomography, to see amyloid plaque buildup in healthy people. We give them a radioactive tracer that attaches to amyloid plaque, and we see where the radiation comes from, and we can say, you've got twice as much plaque as the average person your age. You have half as much plaque. You don't have any plaque. We don't know yet what that means. We do know that if you've got no plaque, you're not going to get Alzheimer's anytime soon. But how long does plaque build up? And plaque is only one part of it. There are lots of healthy, non-demented people who die with amyloid plaque. So amyloid plaque is necessary but not sufficient for getting Alzheimer's disease. Or is it, it's not even clear whether it's causally related. To say necessary is a little odd, but if you will have Alzheimer's disease, you have to have amyloid plaque. Tau tangles we now can image. The amyloid plaque is FDA approved. The tau tangle PET imaging is not yet, but it's being used for research purposes. And again, we can say you've got average, above average, below average, but we don't yet know what percentage of people with above average tau tangles or amyloid plaque at age 60 will be diagnosed with Alzheimer's at 65 or 70 or 75. We will know this as the people who have been tested get followed, there are approximately a gazillion papers so far on this. There are actually more than 100 that my research assistant dug up in just the last 5 years. And we don't yet have, it hasn't been around long. We don't have long follow-up. We don't have big N studies for the most part. But overall, it looks like neuroimaging, and there are other forms of neuroimaging I don't have time to go into, will be able to tell us with 70% accuracy. 70%, what do we mean by accuracy? 70% specificity and sensitivity. Who's going to get Alzheimer's and who's not? Biomarkers, category 4. These are molecules in your blood or in your fluids, things we take out from you. And the most common looks at cerebral spinal fluid. So how many of you have had a lumbar puncture, a spinal tap? How many of you hated it? Okay, yeah. It's not supposed to be a warm and fuzzy kind of experience. Turns out the pictures of brains you see are always kind of incomplete. Your brain actually has this long tail called the spinal cord, which in many ways is part of the brain. And one of the ways it's part of the brain is it is bathed in cerebral spinal fluid like the brain. And so if you want to know what's going on inside the brain, you'd really like to get cerebral spinal fluid. Sticking a needle through a skull is also not pleasant. But you can tap the spine, get the same fluid that circulates through the brain, and look for the levels of tau and of amyloid, and use that as a predictor. Now, that has some downsides. You can take a blood draw and look at either amyloid or tau or other proteins, and also use that to make a prediction. And again, using these various statistical methods, people have said, well, it's about 70% accurate, roughly. Some people say more, some people say less. One of the important things you learn from hanging around biomedicine for a long time is the first paper is always going to report better results than anybody else ever gets. It's not quite true, but there is a tendency for the first paper to be the most startling, the best, and everything else, and this is not malpractice, it's sort of, usually it's regression to the mean. The first one was the lucky one that got the best result. Everybody else drags it down, but we're in there, we're in that category. So I'm going to pretend I didn't say that there were 5 methods, because my mild cognitive impairment, which I hope is really just age-appropriate memory impairment, which I define as your memory isn't as good as you remember your memory having been. And how many of us are there? I don't know what the 5th was, and I'm going to pretend that I didn't have 5 and only had 4, and go on to this question. Let us say that I could offer you a test that would say with 100% positive predictive value and negative predictive value. So note, by the way, this is impossible. No test done by humans is 100% accurate. But if I could, and it would tell you whether or not you're going to get Alzheimer's with it by the time you're 75, how many of you want that test? How many of you do not want that test? How many of you are unsure? That looked roughly 50, 25, 25 to me. Majority in favor of getting tested and roughly equal numbers not wanting. If I'd had more time and paid more attention, I would have been interested in seeing the age breakdown of who raised their hands when. My guess is younger people were more eager to get the test than older people were. So why would you want to get the test? What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? This is my 4th category. First, on the advantage side, you might be able to do some useful interventions to prevent the disease. This would be wonderful if it were possible. So far, I don't want to discourage you from doing crossword puzzles and Sudoku or whatever it is. They're really good at helping you do crossword puzzles and doing number games. And with the crossword puzzles, you learn all sorts of weird words that nobody ever uses outside of crossword puzzles. ORTS, O-R-T-S, for table scraps. They don't help with Alzheimer's. So far, there's only one thing that's been showed in a controlled clinical trial, blinded, to slow the progression of people with mild cognitive impairment to Alzheimer's. Even it doesn't prevent it, but it slows the decline. And so I'm married to a doctor, and over the years, her general view on science about nutrition and personal health has been find the studies you like that tell you to do something you like to do and believe them and ignore everything else. This falls in that category, physical exercise. Not mental exercise, but physical exercise seems to slow the decline of people into Alzheimer's. And they originally thought it had to be cardiovascular. You had to work up a sweat and get that pulse up. Turns out even weightlifting, upper body strength, seems to slow the decline into Alzheimer's. So that's one thing you can do. There's no other medical intervention we know about. And even physical exercise, which you should be doing for other reasons as well, doesn't stop the disease. It just, in some people, slows it. There are a couple of drugs. There's a drug that in 20% of people buys them a few more months in slowing the disease. So I don't want to say there's absolutely nothing, but there's nothing very good. So that's one thing you could do. You could also, though, use this for life planning. Are you going to retire early or retire late? You're going to take that money and do the round-the-world cruise while you can still remember it? What are you going to do with your life if you know you're going to get, if you're pretty confident you're going to get Alzheimer's at a particular age? The third possibility is financial planning. How are you going to plan for yourself? And I was telling Dick Kaplan, we have a mutual friend named Michael Gilfix, one of the fathers of elder law, who says he would tell all his clients to get such a test if it were easily available, because he tends to deal with high net worth people and how they set up their finances if they think they may need 5 years or 10 years or 15 years of nursing care. That makes a difference. Now again, it wouldn't guarantee that they couldn't get some other dementia, wouldn't guarantee they wouldn't get hit by a bus and have it all be moot. But it is some piece of evidence that some people would like to use for their financial planning. So life plans, financial plans, for some people that'll make a difference, for some people it won't. What are the downsides? Well, one downside, and I think for most of us, well, for many of us, the biggest downside is the personal psychological impact. What does it do to you to know that you are going to lose your mind? What does it do to you the next time you forget the name of a student you just had in class last term? I remember the students from my 1986 property class, the first one I taught, better than I remember my students from last fall. That didn't used to be true. But if I knew I was high risk for Alzheimer's, every student's name I forgot would be another reminder of what was going to happen to me. What does it do to your family relationships? Oh, back on the psychological thing. I mean, also, how comfortable are you? How well do you know how you would react? You can say, well, it wouldn't bother me. Or you can say, I think I would go into a deep depression. But how well can you predict your own reaction to something like that? We see from bad news from genetic testing. The good news of this is most people, a year later, return to however happy or unhappy they were to begin with. But people who get bad news get transiently depressed. People who get good news get transiently happy. In the long run, they go back to being happy people or unhappy people for the most part, except, of course, those who got so depressed they committed suicide, or other people who make a mess of their lives during the period of time when they are up or down. Would an Alzheimer's diagnosis have the same effects? We don't really know. Alzheimer's prediction? We don't really know, but the psychological effects, I think, are of concern to people. Maybe almost as much concern as the family effects. And some of this is immediate. If you got diagnosed, predicted to have a very high risk of Alzheimer's, and you were married or had a long-term partner, would you tell him or her? And when would you tell him or her? How soon would you tell them? And what do you think their reactions would be? Not necessarily walk out on you, although that might happen from somebody who really hadn't figured signing up for better or for worse meant signing up to take care of an Alzheimer's patient for 10 years. But change the relationship. See a look of pity in your partner's eyes. How would it affect your relationship? And then maybe more as things get closer, how does it affect the big question, at least in California with people getting Alzheimer's disease? When do the kids take the car keys away? Californian without a car is like a centaur without the horse. You know, to be disabled in California, to be without a car in California is basically to be disabled. Losing the car keys is a big deal. If you're predicted to be at high risk for getting Alzheimer's, you probably lose the car keys sooner, and the checkbook, and other things. So those kinds of family issues are important. not talked about very much. Now, from a legal perspective, we think of discrimination. The employment side of discrimination here is a little easier than in other cases. We're doing this project on predicting schizophrenia, which hits people in their late teens and 20s. There, the employment and education discrimination implications are potentially enormous because they have their employment history in front of them, unless they get schizophrenia, in which case they don't have much of an employment history to look forward to. With Alzheimer's, most of the diagnoses will be people who are post-employment. So maybe if you're considering somebody for a lifetime job, like law professor with tenure, you might be interested in their Alzheimer's prediction. I bet if you're the President of the United States and you're naming a Supreme Court justice, you'd be really interested in it. And it could be that as citizens, when we're naming a President of the United States, we might want to know about this. We might want to know testing. I have lived through, so everybody here has lived through, well, no, maybe not, period with a president who was shortly after he left office diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and through the greatest of all medical instruments, the retrospectoscope, was probably showing some signs of it during his second term. So the employment discrimination issues are there, and they're interesting and tricky legally. There is a Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, which bans discrimination based on genetic information. So if your Alzheimer's prediction is made based on genes, you can't be discriminated against in employment. But it doesn't ban discrimination based on PET scans. So there is no NINA yet, Neuroscience Information Non-Discrimination Act. So that's sort of interesting. And is there an Americans with Disability Act claim when you're predicted but not yet? And this gets to a Supreme Court case called Bragdon v. Abbott about HIV. There's some interesting legal questions, but they're not likely to come up that much, because most people, when they get Alzheimer's, when it becomes an issue, they will be, for the most part, post-employment. Though again, my baby boom generation's done such a bad job of saving for retirement that many of us will never end up being post-retirement, post-employment. What about issues around insurance discrimination? Now, it's not a problem for health insurance for the most part. Almost everybody affected will, by the time they're affected, have Medicare. The ACA will help out for some other people who may not yet be at Medicare in terms of getting them non-risk rated health insurance. GINA will help out, advance health insurance discrimination based on, it'll help those who got the genetic diagnosis. And by the way, if the diagnosis is partially genetic and partially behavioral and partially imaging, does that count for GINA purposes? Interesting question. I don't know that we know the answer to that yet. So those are some issues, but the real problem won't be with health insurance. It'll be with disability insurance and especially with long-term care insurance. Medicare doesn't pay for long-term care. If your generation can ever survive the acute care crisis in costs that my generation is bringing you, you will then get hit with the long-term care crisis in costs, because long-term care is extraordinarily expensive. Now, where I live, people for decent long-term care, they're looking at $60,000 to $80,000 a year. It's more than sending somebody to a private university. And how many people can afford that? Not very many. Medicare doesn't cover it. Regular health insurance doesn't cover it. Medicaid usually covers it, although the quality of places that take Medicaid is maybe on average not as high as one would like. This is going to be a huge issue, and the great hope for this, the great economist's hope, has been private long-term care insurance, which hasn't caught on. But let's say you are predicted to have a high risk of Alzheimer's disease. And there's been a study that actually found this. What do people do? They buy long-term care insurance. Do they tell the long-term care insurer they're at high risk for Alzheimer's disease? Of course not. If you're a long-term care insurer, this is what's called adverse selection. The people selecting your product are adverse to you. They are not the people you would like to get. And it could lead long-term care insurance to dry up and blow away. I think there really is a possibility of a death spiral here. On the other hand, do we allow long-term care insurance to ask you these questions and to require you to be tested and to discriminate against people at risk? That means the people who need it most aren't going to be able to get it. Maybe if that's the only way we preserve long-term care insurance, that's going to be a policy problem. So there's some pluses and some minuses. If you get tested, you have to worry about your psychological effect, the effect on your families, the employment discrimination, the insurance discrimination. All of you who are students, of course, are worried about whether it will affect your chance to be Justice Sotomayor, get appointed to the Supreme Court. Some of us are past, you may not be past that ambition, Vic, but most of us are past that ambition. So those are pluses and minuses to testing. Having gone through those, has anybody changed their mind about whether they'd want to be tested or not? Maybe a little bit. Okay. Think on it longer. The good news is, and this gets to the last category, what should we do? You got a little bit of time, but I don't think a lot. On one question, in one sense, what should we do? Should we change? Should we create a NINA, a Neuroscience Information Non-Discrimination Act? What should we do about long-term care insurance? What should we do about employment insurance? And those are nice legal questions that people, and there's a JD at Cleveland Clinic moving to UCSF, Jelaine Arias, I'm an advisor on her grant project, who's doing a lot of really good 50-state work on these kinds of issues. Those are the classic legal issues, but I want to step back and ask the bigger question. Should we encourage people to get predictive testing? Should we allow it? Should we ban it? Should we discourage it? Some of these tests require FDA-approved devices. Some of them don't. All of them get administered by professionals, and there are guidelines from associations. The guidelines currently discourage testing in anyone who is pre-symptomatic, with the exception of the genetic tests for people with a family history of early onset Alzheimer's, and somewhere in between the ApoE4, when the recommendations are mixed. The FDA has only approved the test for diagnosis, not for prediction. Could be used off-label, but if it's off-label, that means if an FDA-approved device or drug is used for something that the FDA didn't approve it for, a doctor can order it for that, but insurers typically don't have to pay for it. And Medicare and Medicaid, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, have said they are not going to pay for the PET scanning, except for diagnosis. They're not going to pay for it for prediction. Is that right or is that wrong? Should we let people find out when there's no medical intervention that's any good? They can still do life planning, which would be really useful to folks. If we do let them, should we put conditions on it? Should they be required to get counseling before they get the test and after they get the test? I certainly don't think this is something you want to have pop up on your email. Oh, by the way, you're at high risk for Alzheimer's disease. Follow this link to learn all about it, which 23andMe was actually doing. Although in fairness, they did require you to check a box, especially to get ApoE results. Should there be counseling requirements? Should there be disclosure requirements or disclosure possibilities? If you're the physician who has determined that somebody is at high risk for Alzheimer's, do you have an obligation to tell anybody, like the family members? Do you have an obligation to not tell anyone? Should the patient have an obligation, a moral, not legally enforceable obligation, to disclose to people? Because that thing about taking away the car keys, from the parent's perspective, that looks like a problem. From the kid's perspective, that looks like a blessing. Is it a bug or is it a feature? Depends on what side of that you're on. And you may save your dad's life by taking the car keys away sooner. So, two best words from any speaker. In conclusion, you got some time to think about this. I don't think you got a lot. I've been a little surprised that we haven't seen more predictive use being done in the world by neurologists and others. The fact that it's not covered by insurance, the PET scan's a couple of $1,000s, the interpretation is not yet very clear, has cut it down some. The fact that the Alzheimer's Association and the National Institute of Aging have said you shouldn't do this has cut it down some. But I don't think that's going to hold forever. There will be people who want to know, and as the predictions get better and better, I think it gets harder to make a case for preventing people from finding out. Maybe not harder to make a case for making sure they're well informed before they decide to get tested and after they get the results. This is going to happen. It's going to happen for Alzheimer's disease. It's going to happen for other things. It's going to happen whether or not you get Alzheimer's disease, you will get something that we will increasingly be able to predict. How we deal with that as a society. As academics, the default tends to be knowledge is good, more knowledge is better. But in the real world, it's not necessarily that way. More knowledge can be a problem, particularly if people don't use it well or if other people use it against you. So watch this space. I think that questions of prediction are going to get bigger and bigger. They're not just medical issues, they will have implications for how we live our lives, how we do our jobs, how the laws get made, and how we feel about ourselves. We need to figure out as a society better how to proceed with these. And then just as a coda, Dr. Hugo Panera, who invented the "How long will you live?" At the end of the story, he is killed by life insurance goons because the life insurers had noticed the possibilities for adverse selection in his invention. And he was found later with his coat pocket with the date and time of his own death in it. It didn't necessarily work out well for him being able to predict. Let's hope we can avoid his particular fate. Thank you.